looks like our signal is not too bad. Behold the wonderful world of our patrons, which are in print probably too small and blurry to see, but such is the vicissitudes of life, as the saying goes. Okay. And I remembered at last to widen the picture so you can see my hideous mug and the various material that I'm sticking up in front of the camera in a not terribly sophisticated way compared to all of the cute little people, including my co-author Jeanson, who does really neat videos and all the rest. But I'm an old guy, and no cost and no effort and all the rest. So other than the assembling of material for it, plus the research on the books, of which this material connects up. As you recall from last week, Nathaniel Jeanson in Traced was attempting, hi Barbara, attempting to show that the genetic data from human history fits the 4,500-year flood model. And he mentioned a couple papers that clearly didn't indicate that, but he said they were flawed. They based incomplete data. And he then moved to pick on a couple new papers, which is what we're discussing this time. I've alluded to some of this stuff in earlier episodes. Basically, it involves the Karmin paper and then another one that he brings up, Moretti, from 2017, that he's picked on in other papers. And basically, he's reprising an argument that he had from a paper he co-wrote with another creationist, Holland, in 2019. And I'll be putting the link up to that, as well as the Karmin paper and the Moretti paper. The Karmin paper, Jeanson has egregiously misrepresented the contents. And he's culled down through it. It was the stuff that he basically was using as a superstructure for scrunching his genealogical material down. And it's never going to fit. But he goes much farther in Traced, not merely stealing their information and filtering it into the scrunched framework, but actively accusing both the Karmin and Moretti papers, which the Moretti paper was on some genetic material from Denmark that helped clarify aspects of what was going on in Europe, not the entire planet, and accusing both the paper's authors of suppressing data that conflicted with the 200,000-year time frame. He did not actually go into a heck of a lot of detail on this, but the main point that has been pointed out by various critics of Jeanson, including Dan Stern Cardinale, that Jeanson has constantly conflated the mutation rate with substitution rate, and the germline mutations versus pedigree mutations, which are occurring in a particular lineage, as opposed to germline that's taking place in the nucleic things and spills across a broader population base than just a particular pedigree. And by confusing those, and by, in effect, accusing the authors of not paying attention to the information in their own field, because the information that Jeanson is picking up on doesn't relate to the points that they are doing or the information that's needed to arrive at their conclusions. So I checked it with Dan Stern Cardinale on this, just to make sure that I had the understanding right about how Jeanson, just for somebody with a genetics degree, is not playing fair with the data field. It'll be fun for you to look at. You'll be able to see functionally Jeanson's argument that he presents in Traced, because it's essentially a reprise of the arguments that are in the Jeanson and Holland paper. And you'll then be able to compare that with Karmin. By the way, there are data fields and data sets available in Karmin that you can, if you go to the science website for that particular paper, you'll be able to download those for easy peasy free, independently from the spot. I had to pick up a ResearchGate posting of the actual Karmin paper, but the other information is available as well, the science website. So anybody out there with other genetics skills who wants to dive into it, if my interpretation of the facts are in error, do please let me know. But anyway, I think that this is not boding well for Jeanson's bit, because of the half a dozen or so sources he's cited so far, and he's not exactly road race to bring them out. Almost all but two are ones that I would classify as misinterpretations of the data field. Now, the other factor is that he's still got a big chunk of technical literature that he has yet to cite that's in his reference bibliography. And so he's really going to have to start dropping them faster if he's going to catch up with all of it, but we'll find out. I'm hoping that we can at least say by the time we're done with all this that he will have cited everything that's in his reference bibliography. If he blundered on that and forgot to cite something, forgot to actually mention something that was in his reference bibliography, that was another measure of the clumsiness. Or if he's citing material that it doesn't end up in the reference bibliography. I mentioned about how he was doing that with his website material, but I can give him an okay on not having to put linkages on that stuff. But anyway, I'll be particularly looking to see if he can get a little more specific beyond the goof he was making with that one haplotype that he has a totally wacky population distribution for the one haplotype in Africa that all the other regular scientists looking at it are seeing that it's south of the Sahara and has nothing to do with Egypt, let alone people emigrating from Noah and Ararat. It's an absolute mess. And it is a measure of the thing that even Robert Carter, the fellow young earth creationist, is not particularly impressed with this. And from various people, Dan Stern Cardinale and Joel Duff and others who have been kind of monitoring the creationist field, which they do in their lines of stuff, haven't really spotted any indication that, apart from Ken Ham extolling it on the back cover, it doesn't look like it's actually caught on fire in their own young earth creationist framework. And based on what I can see so far, how threadbare the thing is, this doesn't surprise me. Part two relates to an old little post that popped up last December that I thought was particularly hilarious because it was quite an old post from 2012 that CMI decided to trot out 10 years after the fact from David Catchpool. And that's why we have our topic, turtle sex and death in the past. Turtles fossilized while mating, exclamation mark, bum, 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 which of course in creationism speak means it had to be during the flood. Well, the moment you find out about where this is taking place, it's in the Mesel Lagerstätten, which is an Eocene deposit, a toxic lake that has tremendous amount of stratification and can kill little fish and stuff. And there's one of the reasons why you have anything that falls into the thing and decays. It doesn't really decay much because the anoxic conditions prevent that. And you find some really amazing things. The earliest bat is known from Mesel, one of the earliest bats. So where the creationists are trying to deal with it is to produce their flood interpretation and not really offering anything other than hand waving on it. I'll be putting the post up linkage to Catchpool's thing. And it related to a 2012 paper, which by Joyce, caught in the act, the first record of copulating fossil vertebrates, which again is far more interesting, in my opinion, than is the case for Catchpool's little piece. You can cross-compare those. And it relates to the taphonomic matter of the stratified layers in this volcanic lake, which the creationist clearly doesn't like. But the question is, does the regular geologist think that way? And there is a paper that I will be able to put up, Moshade 2020, which had appeared by the time CMI was retreading Catchpool, which confirmed the idea, recolonization of volcanically disturbed Eocene habitats, the Mar Lakes of Mesel and Offental compared, where they were going into the details of why the taphonomy and the preservation of this was so good and what the dynamics of this was telling about how the lakes are going and how this relates to that. There's an older paper that unfortunately I couldn't get open access, but I will put it up here just so you can kind of have a scene of it from 2007. Which is also on the middle Eocene volcanic lake of Mesel. It's an absolutely delicious geological context. that relates to that Lagerstätten issue. Oh, Command Cyborg, good morning, or wherever you are. Well, it's technically early morning here. It's just after midnight. I've found that it's pretty consistent, provided my internet connection is smooth, that the odds that I'm going to be bumping into a glut of people online trying to post all at the same time and clogging up the stupid little studio here, it has proven to be a better place to do it. I was having terrible trouble doing it at 7 p.m. on Wednesday Pacific time in the United States, and this midnight or thereabouts time frame has worked out, I think, much better. Lagerstättens are overall an absolutely fascinating phenomenon and are highly relevant to any discussion of creationist interpretations of fossil preservations, because odds are, if you have lots and lots of magnificently preserved things, odds are that you're dealing with an unusual anoxic condition. And this can occur in volcanic lakes, and it can occur in lagoons in a variety of areas. So it's no coincidence that Solnhofen, that produces Archaeopteryx, is one of these kinds of things. Mesel, which is a volcanic lake, can do that kind of things. You find this with the old red sandstone, with the enormous number of fish fossils that are found in there, and all the way down the line. In no case are creationists prone to offer a very in-depth discussion of the technical details, and you can compare Catchpool with the paper that he directly cites, and also the 2020 paper that is such a follow-up to compare what's going on. Oh, Lagerstätten, yes, that's a it's one. It comes up a lot in the books that I've done. Lagerstätte. And there's an umlaut in there that I can't put in. Lagerstätte. Lagerstätten with an N on the end is plural. So a Lagerstätte is singular. And Stephen Jay Gould pointed it out in his old book, Wonderful Life on the Cambrian, because it came up there. The Burgess Shale is yet another one of those Lagerstätte deposits. And the literal translation is kind of hard to remember what the hell it is, but Gould's version of it is calling it a mother lode deposit. And it's, as we had a little section in Rocks Were There, discussing these various Lagerstätten over the geological time frame, they're the common thread in not all, but most of them is that they're in anoxic conditions. And therefore, you don't have the bacterial growth, you don't have things to break down cells and the like, and so you get these deliciously detailed preservations. The area of the Cambrian ones are somewhat different. They're probably dealing with a very distinctive ocean chemistry that doesn't prevail now. And the fact that not one, but not two, but three Lagerstätten are occurring in the Cambrian, the Sirius Passet, which is up in Greenland, and then the Burgess Shale, which is over in British Columbia, and Xinjiang, that's in China. Although they're all Northern Hemisphere now, they weren't Northern Hemisphere when they were generated. They were very probably equatorial things. And so this, to what extent there's a very distinctive Cambrian ocean chemistry that makes it not inevitable, but easier to have specialized Lagerstätten conditions. There are other deposits, trilobites, and that show up because they don't require Lagerstätten conditions to have their shells, shelly organisms and horns and things like that, shark teeth. They don't require Lagerstätten. So what's going on that's so interesting there? We don't really have any counterparts of that in lots of zones. So if ocean chemistry and conditions alter to the point where you're not getting Lagerstätten, then a whole blank of life that are small and soft-bodied become invisible. Doesn't mean they weren't there. It just is you're not going to have any fossil conditions to be able to preserve them. So a lot of little invertebrates that are known from the Cambrian only from these Lagerstätten, how far their range were they living in areas farther north, farther south? Were they only living in that equatorial band? Because we don't have Lagerstätten to see from what would eventually be in the far north on the Cambrian Paleo world versus stuff that would be, say, at the poles. We can't decide all of that. And it'd be nice if we had some more examples of it, but there we go. Yeah, I think the umlaut goes over that second A, the one in the Städte part. And it's a quite commonly used word, which by and large creationists don't discuss much. I think there's only 1 or 2 postings on it in the entire creationism literature, and they get it very badly. And they don't use it as a common bit. In that respect, it's understandable because creationists try to avoid using the normal terminology in these topics, especially in geology, so that a posting that Steve Bauman, who's one of our little geological technical advisors, on the works that we do when we write up geology chapters, we always shoot them off to Steve to vet through to make sure that we aren't making any goofs. He recently had a chat with Paula Gia, who went through a Eric Hovind video where they were going about Wisconsin dells, and which I've been to, by the way, on a trip east. We stopped off. It was the dead of night. We had been driving a long haul to get over, to manage to get far enough east to be able to do a reasonable amount of days for all the trips that we were doing. It was a big family adventure. We had a van and all that stuff. And Wisconsin dells is much more recent phenomenon, although there's Precambrian rocks showing up in there. And it turns out Steve Bauman knows that area exceedingly well. He's traipsed all over the place. And so he dissected Eric Hovind's really dismal treatment of it that had primarily, it was Steve Austin going in there pointing out things and a few other non-geologists pointing out stuff and all saying, oh, this is the flood, and Steve was accounting for why that wasn't the case. We probably will be linking to that in Rocks Were There Too, because it all connects up to the creationist attempt to turn the Grand Canyon into a flood deposit. And they're frequently picking on other pieces of real estate in the same context to argue catastrophic things, or in this case, that this was during the Ice Age, that in their view occurs right after the flood, a couple hundred years. So long as you avoid most of the data, you can get into a mess on that. So the Lagerstätten issue, we brought it up in the first book because it does relate to the whole notion about how fossil preservation occurs and to what extent Precambrian organisms that are also soft-bodied but extremely small would even show up at all. And without any Lagerstätten class deposits in the Ediacaran period, for example, you don't see much. One of the few things that qualifies as that is the phosphatization stuff that's in China that preserves embryos of something or other. And anybody who's read the papers on that would be aware of the fact that phosphatization only can preserve things up to about 0.5 millimeter in size. So the little embryos that are forming, these very possibly could be sponges. They could be, some of them might actually be from Metazoans, but until you have enough cell cleavages to see how things are developing way above the 0.5 millimeter area, all you've got is just a bunch of little pieces of dead Metazoan embryos, but not exactly what they are to even know what phylum they're in. It would be swell if we had Lagerstätten deposits to be able to show some of these things, although even then they would be very likely extremely limited because of how small so many of these are. We do know there were some little small organisms like that were yayish big, and the biggest one would be Dickinsonia, that is about the size of a kitchen rug for in front of the sink, or a bath mat in the bathroom, meter long around there. And still some debate as to whether or not it was a sessile organism or whether or not it could move at all. There's a little bit of indication on that. You have various trails and things that are made by something or other that you don't know what they are because they're no Lagerstätten. So it's a really critical piece of information to have when trying to discuss anything in relation to the early history of life, which is Cambrian on back, because of the fact that you would have to ask, how would they be preserved? And how likely would that be? What would they look like? And what can you make of the fact that you can have circumstantial clues that a lot of ecosystem is going on that is invisible because we don't have any logger statement? My favorite example is a little Cloudina, which is yay big or so. They look like little tubes. And they actually survived past into the Cambrian. But because none of them, I don't think much of any of them are preserved in the Burgess Shale or other lagerstätten. And there's quite a lot of examples of them that have little boreholes in the side, particularly back in the Ediacara period. And so you've got the reasonable assumption that there's a little organism living inside it of what we don't know, and something outside it is trying to eat it, and so it's burrowing in to find it and presumably devouring it that way. Why it doesn't go up to the hole in the top, we don't know, because we don't know what the little organism was in there. And the fact that we can't answer those questions is precisely because we don't have any lagerstätten for those areas. Yet something, Cloudina was living for millions and millions and millions of years and continued on even into the early Cambrian, and yet we don't know what it is. I, as a historian, find that so much easier to deal with, because history deals with oodles of things that something happened, but you can't tell what because you don't have the information on it. I am something of an amateur historian on games. So chess and card games and dominoes and backgammon and these various other things, I'm aware of the history of those to the extent that people can work them out. And yet there are gigantic holes in any of that, which, because we don't have information, people didn't write down the rules of things. So we have fragmentary preservation of the pieces of things. And it's not for centuries later that people start writing down what the rules of them are. And so you have to kind of interpolate stuff in exactly the same way the paleontologists have to do. So for me, as a historian, I'm not at all thrown off by the idea that there's holes in stuff. But yet, the very fact that you have a blip here and a blip here 100 million years later and blips farther down the road means that you have the necessity to make sense about what was going on in an ecosystem area. And people way above my grade, who are actual paleontologists, are very meticulous about working out the implications these kind of things are for ocean chemistry, the turnovers that are taking place in the Precambrian, into the Cambrian, and into the later Cambrian, about how much of stuff is deep ocean, how much of it's shallow ocean, how things are fitting in connections up with stuff, the amount of oxygen that's being thrown out that's oxygenating the oceans and eventually oxygenating the atmosphere, and how much ocean mixing is going on, and that's altering things. Turns out Zach Hancock was doing a thing about Darwin's contribution to the understanding of barnacles. And this is of relevance in the creationist avoidance of trying to figure out how many kinds of barnacles there are. Or Kent Hovind, I think, was making an idiot video, which Zach was responding to. And the interesting feature is that some of the shifts that are taking place in those barnacle forms that are known from the fossil record apparently relate to how they were dealing with phosphorus to form the little shell cuticles rather than calcium. And that the ocean chemistry was changing to where phosphorus was becoming increasingly a problem in the Devonian. And you find the barnacles moving on over, as quite a few other organisms that had to make shells in that that did, of replacing it with calcium, which was more easily accessible. And so all of that is the kind of forensic game that goes on in the geological context that is just absolutely fascinating to me and right up my alley as a historian, as you're trying to figure out the forensic clues of what's happening in one little point and what that implies for the next point, and that eventually you have to reach a thing that maybe then is very well documented in a fossil context, and everything that has to have happened before then has to be consistent with arriving at where you are now. You'll find also another good reason for reading up on the Lagerstätte and things is they will be discussing a lot of organisms in a lot of different periods. More recent stuff like Mesel, which is like 50 million years old, the Solnhofen, which is like 150 million years old, Jurassic, and then the Cambrian stuff, which is over 500 million years old. That you'll get an awful lot of the map of time issue about what organisms there are, and when you dive more and more into them, and if you think about what they're talking about, you'll see how different all those worlds are. And if you start them plugging together the big panoply of life from the Cambrian into the rest of the Paleozoic and then into the big Mesozoic, when you have the development of mammals and dinosaurs and birds and so much, and then you have big mass extinctions popping along every once in a while, and then the mammal-dominated period after the KT. Boy, that sure looks evolutionary. And the more of those data blips you have on your collar, the harder it's going to be for a creationist to persuade you that they've got an even rudimentary understanding of the facts, that it's all at the cartoon level. And they can make bold statements, ooh, flood, big slosh. But that doesn't mean that they're actually offering a cogent argument for it. It's part biogeography issues, it's part taphonomy, which is why certain organisms end up dead in certain contexts and why we get the certain levels preserved. Right now, I was plugging in some more information for volume 2 of Rocks on the soft tissue stuff, which is the last section of the second chapter of the new book. And incorporating the newer material that Joel Duff, who's also keeping track of this issue from his end, he has the hemoglobin challenge, which is paying attention to how creationists misrepresent soft tissue, and in particular, whether they talk about hemoglobin and blood and stuff, because no hemoglobin has been preserved from these ancient organisms, not once. And yet creationists keep claiming and using that word as if that had. What you actually find is the decay products of hemoglobin that turn into the parts like heme that are extremely durable and can be preserved in some remarkably detailed ways that can be measured a long time after because it doesn't break down. And representing which pieces and why, what cross-linkages occur in certain biomolecules, which accounts for why some can get preserved and others can't. It's a fascinating and ongoing and improving field. And boy, you're not going to get much of the fiddly bit details on it. A little element that came up in a discussion that Jackson Wheat, my co-author, and Dapper Dino had with a really amiable creationist, Jeremy Spry, where along the way he pointed out that the soft tissue issue was really impressive to him. And what was revealing about it is that later on in this long chat, and we're going to be citing all of this in the new book and that, so there'll be references and stuff on that. Anyway, that Dapper and Jackson reminded that the presence of iron had been worked out by Schweitzer and her team. It was an enormous factor in facilitating the cross linkages that can produce these preservations of certain biomolecule remnants. And what was the revealing thing to me about it is that when Spry was apprised of this information, he'd never heard of it. Well, gosh, was it because the information wasn't there? Or that he hadn't heard of such information in his creationist reading? Now, there's bits and pieces. He can't, if he was really immensely thorough, he would have bumped into this issue because there are a few creationists who have actually tried to, hello, Lavender, how you doing, honey? Several of the creationist writers, and we'll be covering it all in Rocks 2, have lit into Schweitzer and the particular papers that relate to this iron preservation factor. And they do a terrible job of disposing of it. But the point is that a few of them at least mention it. And yet Spry had never heard of it. So is Spry reading at the kind of upper echelon summary level rather than diving down into the technical papers in a way where he would be bumping into this stuff? That's entirely possible. And because there would be just scads of areas for the creationists to be bumping into this stuff, mostly through Brian Thomas, who just is prolific as all get out. I've got at least, I don't know, 20 or so different posts that he's done from like 2009 on. He just is constantly churning them out, and various people who copy his material. So he's kind of the go-to authority from the ICR on this. He was also co-authoring stuff with Bob Enyart. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Bob Enyart, he was a little snotty numbskull radio interviewer creationist who was also an anti-vaxxer and dropped dead of COVID, I think last year. And so his partner Williams has had to take over the cudgel in there. So pseudoscience can occasionally kill you. But he was always terribly smug. He's had David Capege, who's another arrogant bastard amongst the creationists. He pops up, also exceedingly prolific. Capege fancies himself, if you haven't heard of him, I'll type his name in here, David Capege. He was the one who was fired from the Jet Propulsion Lab for being a jerk, essentially. An unproductive jerk, ultimately. And he lost. I think they went through a long lawsuit, and he partly lost and found some. Anyway, it was a complicated thing. Hubarin. And these are, Capege has a little website that basically riffs off of virtually every scientific paper that could possibly have some connection to a creationist theme, and he starts at it and puts big things in green and all that. It's just vomitously voluminous stuff. I have chunks of Capege in my data field, but I don't have the time or the inclination to be comprehensive. Somebody who really feels like being anal retentive precise could spend a lot of time just cataloging all the claims and all the different papers that just Capege has churned about for the last 15, 16, 17 years easy. I think it certainly goes back 2007. Hi, Brian. These are the kind of peripheral people that I'm not entirely sure that Capege is all that influential. I mean, he certainly is an echo chamber, but to think about it, I'm not exactly seeing him being relied on all that often by regular creationists. And so I think generations of scholars coming along after I'm gone will probably want to kind of taxonomize and organize in an even greater detail who exactly networks with who. And Joel Duff and people on that side who will be studying these kind of things attentively can be thinking through how ICR, CMI, AIG, and then the asterisks. You've got the paleo group that pops in and out. Websites sometimes disappear on them. They're the kinds who think that there were dinosaurs alive in recent times, and that they're pretty well fringe. And of course, you have the Kent Hovind groupies that are still knocking around. And that links up with Walter Brown and all the rest. But you've got all these little sidebars of New Age pseudoscience, where there's always been a little bit of a trend amongst hyper-conservative basement-level creationists to feed off of end times apocalyptics and stuff that would connect you with ancient astronauts. And you find little bits and pieces of it that bump into Zecharia Sitchin and his Sumerian space gods and all of that. These are all people that usually have very relatively little following. They may or may not write any little books, or may have a little website somewhere, or maybe doing videos. These things pop up, and these kind of metastasize in little cross-current nuggets that will have one person that will connect up with this one here, and one person will connect up to that one there in this long daisy chain of goo that operates at the level below the PhD pompous academic types that you're seeing up at ICR, CMI, AIG, and then over in the corner, the very pompous academic types that you have at the Discovery Institute. Now, some of these people can kind of start rubbing shoulders in that political context. Eventually, I hope to be able to do the Culture Camp book, which will, a lot of dust will have settled by then as well, by the time I get around, because I've got a bunch of books to write yet with Jeanson. But the fact that some of the young Earth creationists, Sanford and company, have been percolating over into doing collaborative work with people in the intelligent design camp. And I'm wagering that the ones who will benefit most from this will be in the young Earth creationist bunch rather than in the intelligent design stuff. So there's a lot of flux going on. Creationism, you see, whether they like it or not necessarily in a good direction. This is not survival of the fittest. This is the survival of the most economically viable. If they can get enough people to support them. I mean, Answers in Genesis, I think if you would look at the funding level for a CMI, it's operating at a much lower level than you find at AIG. And you're still bumping around in issues about whether or not the Discovery Institute is starting to get a little bit tight. ICR, the Institute for Creation Research, they opened up a lot of big stuff. They don't have nearly anything as elaborate as the Creation Museum at AIG. And I noticed that their little Acts and Facts book magazine has gone from 12 issues a year down to only 6. And a lot of it is lighter and trying to maintain the same image, but they're the equivalent of the people who decide to put less crackers in the box and put it in the same size box and just lower the amount of ounces that you have on the bottom, and you maybe not look too close to find out that they're actually selling you less stuff. That applies apparently as well to the ICR. How much of that's going to continue to accelerate now that Guliuza, who is the head of the ICR, has his obsessions about banishing natural selection from the picture, which is already causing a little bit of splits in the creationist community. And then you've got Answers in Genesis with their jihad that they're doing against anybody that puts in too much evolution or is willing to entertain a created world that's maybe older than 6,000 years. That I was just putting into the new book, the discussion on that stuff. It's an area that's in flux. So the goal that I've been trying to do for writing the new material is to keep it as up to date as possible and try to funnel in the relevant information that will make it as useful as possible once it hits print. That it will be a very useful compendium of stuff that between Volume 1 and Volume 2 will cover in a great deal of detail, more than any other version of these things, why the creationism movement is wrong. Wally World has been caught doing that here. My, yes. Particularly ironic because I might someday be in the amusement park business if I could get billions of dollars available, because I designed an amusement park that Disneyland on a big scale, Nat Park. For those who want to kind of get a look at the bloody thing, I was actually shown in a special on, I think, Remember When, I think it's called. It's available on YouTube. The story of Natatorium Park from our local PBS channel here. And I'm at about minute 50, where they showed a little shot of the design that I came up with for a new upgraded Nat Park, couple square miles of amusement park. In a way, it was kind of nice that I would never have had funding for this, because my God, we would have hit a brick wall with COVID and the problems of trying to operate a big amusement facility in the middle of a pandemic. And of course, technology had changed. The line spillover concept, KSPS, PBS, yes, indeed, Barbara, that the line spillover problem in that old style amusement parks had to deal with is functionally fading away. I haven't been to Disneyland or the Universal parks in that to measure how they're dealing with it. But I think the technique that they're using now is all using your smartphone, where they have an app that you will, when you want to get onto a particular high load ride, you just put a reservation in and it'll alert you when you need to show up to get into the relatively short line. So they eliminate that whole structure. So technology marches on. And so I keep in the back of my head the prospects of a Mark III design for Nat Park, if I can ever con people into supplying the funds and stuff, and bumping to enough billionaires to where they would go, "Hey, guys, we got to build this thing." So anyway, yeah, it's I never run out of little projects to do, and unfortunately, most of them that I have fascination with involve more finances than I have at my disposal. Although I am working as a little sidebar on making up a new version of my politique game that we did some play testing on down in Arizona a couple of years ago when our bunch went down in there at the end of the pandemic. And it involves some really nice little rearrangements in the amount of cards and stuff that I was using, adding new tiers of stuff and restructuring stuff and that. And when I decided to check in to find out how I could get some new sheets and boards and stuff and blank cards and that to do all of this stuff, turns out, boy, what a difference decades makes, because you've got a bunch of different manufacturers that can generate this stuff at relatively reasonable cost, that I can have professionally printed cards and all that kind of stuff in a way, just download PDFs and things like that. It's in the same counterpart as the printing on demand that I use with the books. So technology marches on, and old farts like me old dogs like me get to do new tricks, and we have a lot of fun doing that. So, oh yes, Purple Ryan's getting ready for bed, but popped in to say hi. Yeah, let's. You can catch the show. We're at about 41 minutes. We're going pretty good on that. I want to make sure that big slosh chapter is finally tucked away. The last segment to deal with is the Armitage, which I've decided to call that section Armitage Blows His Shofar. I think that's kind of Armitage. Oops. Armitage. His name is spelled this way. That it kind of reflects the fact that he is a religious guy, and the fact that the horn issue, one of his star witnesses for this soft tissue thing is this Triceratops horn. And there is an adequate reason to suspect that it's no such thing, that it's actually from one of the, I think, bison longinus or something like that, which is an extinct form of bison that existed in the same physical space as where these fossils are coming. And since he was so vague about exactly where he dug the bloody thing up, and although he's got some little photographs and stuff, it's really rudimentary from a paleontological angle. And he's not a trained paleontologist on that. And he's written a few little papers and all that since, which haven't actually been extolled all that much. Most of the creationists that bring up the subject are kind of riffing off the material they did before, and he's done a couple of videos and that too. I'm not anticipating that there's going to be a huge amount. I think he's got a microscopy or one of these little minor journals in that he has somebody with an in with, and so he publishes some of the stuff in there, not in regular creationist journals, although he's also doing stuff in the creationist journals. So anyway, we'll be covering all of that. That's the final end game for chapter 2, and then chapter 3, then I'll be diving into all that cosmology stuff, formation, the Big Bang, formation of the planets, comets, all of the decaying magnetic field. Several of the comets and magnetic field decay is still a really hot item, as, wow, this is pro-creation, as Jeremy Spry indicated in his talk with Jackson. It's one of the nice things about conversations, rather than heated debates, but just a conversation, is that you can find out what people actually think and what basis they're dealing with, even if they don't reveal their sources per se. They're telling you the hot button items that are sticking in their head. So soft tissue, magnetic field decay, cometary formation. These are things that clearly were important enough for Spry that he has them right at his fingertips. So that's stuff that's all going to be covered in the chapter 3. And then Jackson and then will be funneling me in due course the various chapters for the additional that we're dealing with, the 5. We'll be connecting up whale evolution and formation of vertebrates in Tiktaalik and the human evolution and the whole Darwinian racism stuff that's the obsession of creationists, including all the stuff in Answers in Genesis. But that spills over very much into intelligent design because you've got Richard Weikert and that crowd that just keep churning this stuff out. I think he's probably got little voodoo dolls of Darwin and Ernst Haeckel in there. So that's giving you clues about where we're going on that. I will end with a reprise of the thought that, my gosh, I am sadly disappointed at the slim level of documentation that Jeanson's putting into this trace book. You'd think that, actually the Sun released a Carrington level event just it was potted away from us all day. Oh, yes. Well, why is it to worry about that little thing? One of the little sidebars I have to pay attention to, there were, for my paralogs of fog novel, has to do with the telegraph lines and solar flares and things like that. There's a historical record of particularly bad moments. And so you have things where telegraph lines were sparking and things are catching fire and all that stuff in various locations around the world. And so I've been keeping track of all of that from roughly 1872 down into the 1908 period, because it figures in my Paralogs of Fog novel, and I'm cleverly insinuating these incidents and time frames into the things because, of course, our heroes have wireless telegraphy way ahead of everybody else. And so I also had to pay attention to it in case that I'm having them try to communicate with one another over long distance. And there would have been problems with the atmospherics at that particular time. So it's a lot of fun to do. Yes. Yes. Well, the creationists could stand up and pray for the God to stop all of that. But a solar flare, the only reason why it doesn't look like one has ever actually slammed across the Earth. And the odds are really remote because not only would it have to be coming across the ecliptic, but it has to be passing Earth's orbit at the point that Earth is at that spot. So the odds are really low because the solar system is really, really, really big. So the odds being such, we've been having this little crap game. One of the mass extinctions, and I'm trying to think, I think the Ordovician, there is a circumstantial argument that that may have been triggered by the shock wave coming off of a nearby supernova. And that's why it's affecting stuff up on the upper surface and not so much farther down in the ocean, the selectivity of it. But although there's also volcanic activity that's going on, and it's a little bit more complicated and all that kind of stuff. But anyway, I would say that electromagnetic pulses hitting the planet, blasting our atmosphere off, obliterating all of our electronics and all the rest, it would be not good. And we want to avoid that. So send a memo to the Sun and let it say, please stay calm. Make sure that when you are going to burp, make sure you burp away from where we're going to be. Pay attention to all those things. Show some kindness there, Mr. Sun. It won't do a damn bit of good, but nevertheless, it might make us feel better to imagine that we are in control of that kind of thing. So we're at 48 minutes. We've had good signals all the way down the road. Anybody got any last minute comments or questions before I pull the plug on our little show? If not, be careful in the case of yo-yo weather. You've got messes with the flooding in California. You've got places in the back east. Our weather is kind of stable here for the moment in the Pacific Northwest. We've got, although we're supposed to get a little bit more rain and stuff, but we've managed to avoid some of the worst of some of these little storm things that come along us. And to some extent, that's kind of a common feature. That stuff hits farther east from us now then. Oh, yes. Remember to like and such good people. Yes. Like and subscribe. All the links for those who can afford to plug up a little and follow up on the stuff. All the books are available. There's a link at Amazon links that I put into all of the descriptions now, so anybody can find them really, really easy. Anybody who likes the fictional end of it and like historical mysteries and science fiction and that sort of stuff, I think you'll find the paralogs kind of fun. And I'm plowing along with a little luck. I'm hoping to finish that by next year. I'll be able to tell how far I am in the book by Christmas time this year, where theoretically the Fogs should be doing their little thing down on the riverboats on the Mississippi, and the poor fellows that looked into places they shouldn't at Black Rock will be regretting it. And you'll have no idea what any of that refers to, although you'll have clues about it in the second novel, because there's an awful lot of characters in Black Rock, Nevada, which is a really deep in joke as to why I said it there, shows up in the second Paralogs novel. And then, of course, all the sciencey stuff, which you can use as a cudgel for any creationist, if you can afford it. And get a copy and donate it to your local library so that they'll have this stuff in their science department. You could even bring it to the attention of colleges and stuff you're in. Apart from the fact that it doesn't have illustrations, Evolution Slam Dunk is at the college level in terms of technical citation. And other than the fact that it with illustrations, it would have been perfect for that. And shameless plug, I do speaking. If somebody in some college is having a conference or something and you think that I would be useful to that, and they can scrape up the per diem to sit me down there. If it's within driving distance, I can drive. I mean, you'd have some place to stay, that kind of a thing. I would be delighted to participate in that. I'm a pretty keen lecturer. I'm good at stuff. I'm a whiz bang at Q&A. I've had nice responses on all the material that I do, and I certainly have the capacity to discuss both the creation evolution issue and historical matters. There's a whole bunch of stuff that I have interest in, so we could have fun on a lot of little levels. So, heck, if somebody knows how to, I can't hardly nominate myself, but heck, a TED Talk, I'd be happy to do that. I know exactly what I'd tell TED Talk. Yes, everything you need to know about life, you could work out from Twilight Zone episodes and Rodgers and Hammerstein musicals. And I'm quite serious. So anyway, spread the word. Tell everybody about what's the thing, the various books. The old RJ can use the royalties, and you'll get a really good read on it. And I'm very proud of the works, and I will be plugging away, writing on things as long as I can, because there's so much information out there, and it just pisses me off that more people don't know about this stuff. So everybody take care, and accept no wooden penguins. We will see you next week, kids.